All right, so now here we are in chapter 17, specifically we're in 17.1, and in 17 and in 18 what we're talking about are our host defenses. So basically what we're doing is we're talking about how our immune system, specific to humans, defends against all of these things that we've been talking about all semester. So when we're talking about non-specific defenses, what we're talking about are non-specific innate immune defenses, which means that these are things that we are innately born with or have when we're born. This is not something that is accumulated over time. This is just something that exists as is. And that's what we're talking about here in chapter 17. In chapter 18, we're going to be talking about our adaptive immune defenses. So when we talk about our non-specific innate immune defenses, we're talking about three different types of defenses. So first, what we'll take a look at are physical defenses, which include physical barriers, our mechanical defenses, and our microbiome here in chapter 17.1. Then in 17.2, we'll take a look at our chemical defenses. And then in 17.3, we'll look at our cellular defenses. And then in point 4 and point 5, we'll be taking a look at some other stuff. So first, we're going to start with our physical defenses. So as you can probably imagine, when we're talking about our physical defenses, we're talking about our physical barriers, something that's going to prevent pathogens from getting into our body. So they prevent microbes from reaching the tissues that are then susceptible to infection, right? So we have our actual physical barriers. The one that you can think of the most, or might think of the most, is the skin, right? So we have an actual physical barrier. We're trying to keep things out of the inside of our body, where things are a little bit more vulnerable than our skin. So when we're talking about our skin, or even tissues, what we're going to be talking about is taking a look at our physical defenses at the cellular level. So at the cellular level, we have them tightly joined together. So it's not that our cells are kind of floating around. They're very tightly woven together or kind of stuck together in different ways. And this is to prevent pathogens from getting into deeper tissue. So we'll take a look at our mucous membranes, and we'll also take a look at our other endothelium. And what all of these things do have in common is that even when we're talking about the skin or other different membranes, these are barriers that include cells, right? Because we're made up of cells. And these cells are joined together very tightly so that pathogens can't get in between them. And then hopefully they can't get through the cell itself as well. And then, as we already mentioned, we have the skin. When we look at the skin, we actually have three different layers within the skin, and these are all made up of closely packed cells. So we're going to take a closer look at the skin and how it effectively removes or prevents pathogens from getting into the body. But here we're talking about that there are at least three layers of these really tightly packed in layers of cells that are going to prevent things from getting further, or hopefully prevent things from getting further in. Then we have our mucous membranes. So our mucous membranes, as the name kind of implies here, is that they are things that produce mucus. So membranes are linings, tissue linings that produce mucus or that are moist. So lining of the nose, for example, so the nasal cavity, the mouth or the oral cavity, our lungs, our urinary tract, and our digestive tract. So those all include mucous membranes, so layers of tissue that have very closely packed cells that also produce mucus or are moist. Then we have other endothelia. So endothelia are the cells that are lining our urogenital tract. Sometimes those two systems are combined, the urinary system and the genital system. Also, we have blood vessels, which are made up of endothelia, so a thin layer of cells. Not a mucous membrane because they don't produce mucus or they're not moist in that way, but the blood vessels are a type of endothelia. Also, lymphatic vessels are made up of endothelia. So these are the cells that are lining those lymphatic vessels, and we also have the lymphatic vessels that we'll talk about a little bit later, and then some other tissues. So we have these different actual physical barriers where these cells are lined up, packed in, sewn together, basically attached to each other, preventing things from getting through. So let's take a look at how these things are kind of sewn together or packed together, because the first one is really what I think of with these tight junctions. When I say sewn together, you can see that what we're looking at here, this here is the plasma membrane of a cell that would kind of continue along over here, and then this one is the plasma membrane of a cell that would continue on over here. And so these two plasma membranes are connected to each other. And again, they're connected to each other very, very tightly. When this is one type of cell junction, is a tight junction. So a cell junction is where we have these cell membrane proteins that are going to connect with either the extracellular matrix or with complementary proteins from neighboring cells. So when we say our extracellular matrix, we're talking about outside of the cell matrix, so the stuff that's outside of a cell. So if we're talking about connective tissue specifically, connective tissue is made up of different types of cells, but also different types of fibers and other things. So that would make up the extracellular matrix. And so some cells are going to be connected to or attached to that extracellular matrix. Or they'll be connected to other cells, so with complementary proteins from neighboring cells. So different tissues in the body have different types of cell junctions, and this is really going to be based on the function of that tissue. So, for example, on the skin, we need something like a tight junction. We don't want the skin to rip or tear, and it can easily be pushed and moved around. But in some other areas where we want things to be a little bit more fluid, or we need things to move from one cell to another, we might use something like these gap junctions. So the gap junctions here are like little tiny tubes that go between the cells. So for example, in our heart, our cardiac tissue cells are connected through gap junctions. And this is because we want that electrical signal to be able to go through very, very quickly from one cell to the next cell. However, we still want those cells to be attached to each other so that as our heart is pumping and moving, those cells don't just slip away from each other. So we have like gap junctions, for example. So remember, however, that proteases from microbes may be used to break down these different types of cell junctions because these cell junctions are made up of proteins. So like so many other things in our body, these proteins are the ones that are going to be connecting these cells to each other or these cells to the extracellular matrix. So we have the tight junctions, for example. You can see perhaps why they're called tight junctions. I kind of think of somebody as taking a needle and kind of sewing these together. And they're very, very tight. They pull that thread really tight, and the cells are attached to each other at at many different points throughout the plasma membranes. And this is going to hopefully prevent pathogens from getting between the cells here because they've got these barriers along the way. And so this is just kind of showing one plane here, but you can see that there are so many of these barriers. So hopefully the pathogen can't get between them. Then over here we have our desmosomes. This is just another type of junction where the proteins that are between the two cells, so again a plasma membrane, are going to be attached into other proteins on the other side. So they reach a little bit deeper. It's not just over here like with the plasma membranes. They reach a little bit deeper. They're a little bit stronger in areas where we have some movement and some some movement, some flex, and so we still need those to be very tightly held together. And then we already mentioned the gap junctions over here, which are holding these two plasma membranes or cells together, but there's an allowing for things to move between the two cells. Now, all of these things are made up of proteins, and again, we have these proteases that microbes have learned how to use or learned how to make so that they can then get through these things. So even if this is a very tight junction here, if a pathogen, if bacteria, for example, is here and it makes that protease, it can just break down that protein, continue moving, break down this protein, continue moving, and then eventually get inside of the human and wherever this particular tight junction is. So then the second one that we mentioned is the skin. And this is the one, again, we often think of when we think of a physical barrier because it is a really good physical barrier. Again, it contains 3 layers. And it's a very thick barrier between microbes and that are outside of the body and then our deeper tissues. So the 3 layers that you should be familiar with are from most superficial to deep. Superficial means more toward the surface. So the epidermis here is more toward the surface, and this is our most superficial layer. So it has lots of layers of closely packed cells, not just 3. All of these cells in here. This is the epidermis. And so this is not very zoomed in, but you can kind of tell how they're trying to show all of these different cells in here. And so there's layer after layer after layer within the epidermis of cells. And in just a moment, we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about the epidermis. But for now, let's move into the dermis. So the dermis is just the next layer down or deep to the center of the body. And this contains our follicles, meaning our hair follicles. So you can see that our dermis goes from the bottom here, or the deep part of the epidermis, up to the top of the next layer, which is the hypodermis. It's a relatively thick layer of the skin. And this is where a lot of our stuff is attached or comes in, because the epidermis doesn't have a lot of these things. So for example, the hair follicle is within the dermis. This is where we have a lot of our glands, like for example, our sweat glands are within the dermis, and then they just have a piece of their tubing that goes up through the epidermis so that that sweat can get onto the surface of the skin. We also have our oil glands in here, so additional glands. This gland, an oil gland, is actually attached to a hair follicle, and then the oil is put onto the surface of the hair follicle to make sure that it maintains moisture, but then that also gets oil out onto the surface of the skin as well. This is also where we find nerves. That's that yellow kind of tube here, and that includes our receptors, our pain receptors and other types of receptors. There's the nerve. And then also our blood vessels. So you can see here there's the red and the blue trying to indicate they're our artery and our vein. And they go throughout the dermis, and they actually have to go very close. You can see a lot of them at this illustration are up very close to the epidermis because the epidermis does not have any blood flow. It is avascular. So the dermis really contains a lot of blood vessels because then all of the stuff from the blood vessels needs to move into through cell transport into the cells of the epidermis. And then also the rest of the stuff here is a lot of that connective tissue that I was mentioning previously. So we have some different types of connective tissue there that are good for wear and tear and give some cushion and things. And then they're also protecting all of these things in here. One we didn't mention here, this green, is the lymphatic vessels as well. So then our third layer is the hypodermis, hypo meaning below, below the dermis, and that is this section here. And this is mostly a layer of fatty tissue. So you can see it's kind of yellow and lumpy. That's indicating the fatty tissue, the adipose tissue. But it does contain some blood and lymph vessels. So it does have blood and lymph vessels in it as well. So those three layers are a lot to get through for a pathogen to get into the body through the skin. Pretty good barrier. But I want to talk a little bit more about the epidermis and why even just the most superficial portion of the skin, the epidermis, is a really good barrier to allowing pathogens in the body or preventing pathogens from getting in the body. So again, the epidermis consists of cells. Those cells contain what's called keratin. This is a very hard protein. So within the epidermis, the cells actually start at the bottom here. We have this kind of layer here is actually made up of a whole bunch of little cells, and these are the stem cells for the epidermis. These stem cells for the epidermis are going to be going through mitosis and making copies of themselves. When they do that, that copy is pushed upward. So when a cell makes a copy of itself, then it actually puts that copy up here, and then this same cell makes another copy. It's going to push this other cell up. So we have a second one, and then this was our first one that was made. So as this cell, this stem cell, continuously divides, it continues to put another cell up above it, pushing the cells that were already here up further. And so then we have many, many layers of cells. Now when this cell first divides right here, it doesn't have much keratin in it. But as this cell is living its life and it's moving closer and closer to the surface superficially, then it's going to be building up and making more and more and more and more keratin. As it does this, then it actually eventually ends up filling entirely with keratin so that all of the other organelles are no longer working or are pushed out. When this happens, then we have this very, very hard cell. It's no longer metabolically active, so it's actually dead at that point, but it contains so much keratin, it's a very hard, rough cell. And so this cell, this surface cell, actually remains connected for a period of time even though it's completely filled with keratin. So for some time, we still have those cell junctions that are attaching these cells together, but these, at this point, even though they're not metabolically active, they're still there, they're still attached to each other. Until this first cell down here, the stem cell, and its continuous duplication or making copies of itself pushes those off. But while they're still there, it makes that surface really tough because of that really tough protein, keratin, and resistant to degradation by bacterial enzymes. So it is a protein, so it can be broken down. But if we have this entire cell that's filled with protein, it's going to be really difficult for a pathogen to work its way through all of those proteins to get inside. Of course, they'll try, but it makes it difficult for them. Now, the dead skin cells that are on the surface of the epidermis are continuously shed. So again, as this stem cell is making new copies of itself, it's pushing those cells further and further and further toward the surface, then that surface layer is going to be shed. So it's going to be coming off all the time. When this happens, then the idea is that it's going to be taking microbes with them. So if we have a pathogen that's working its way in here and it's working its way down, and we have these cells that continuously are pushing upward, eventually we're hoping that our cells being pushed upward is going to be faster than the pathogen working its way downward. And so then when this top layer gets washed off or sloughed off, then it's going to take that bacteria with it or that pathogen with it. This is another reason that hand washing or degerming is a good thing, because we have this layer of dead cells, and if pathogens are working on trying to get through those layers of dead cells to get to the living cells and inside the body, if we wash our hands, then we can wash those things away. That said, we have spoken a lot about the environment on our skin and how that's beneficial. We have spoken about the microbiome on the surface of our skin, to where we don't want to wash that off constantly because that can then leave us open or available to pathogens. Now, we also have fatty acids that are on the skin's surface. These are going to create an environment that is not very friendly for pathogens. So it creates a dry environment, a salty environment. So a lot of our sweat glands are going to be producing sweat, and then we have these fatty acids on the skin surface. So it's going to be dry, it's going to be salty, and then it's also acidic. So not a very welcoming or inviting place, right? Because being acidic, that's difficult to live in. Salty, so need to be halotolerant, for example, and then also dry. So, microorganisms need a lot of water. So if it's a dry environment, then it's going to be difficult for them to continue living. So this is going to inhibit the growth of the microbes and then make them resistant to breakdown by enzymes. So the keratin is a really important protein that's filling those cells and protecting us. Then we also have, if we have compromised skin barrier. So if we, for example, have a cut in here and it's going to reach so deep that it's going to touch down into the dermis even. If it touches down into the dermis, then that's when we would have blood. Or the cut would be bleeding. It doesn't need to be a gash. It can just be, a paper cut that bleeds, for example. Typically a paper cut, however, because they don't bleed, or if they don't bleed, it's because it's just gone through the epidermis. And remember, we just said that the epidermis is avascular. So if you slice part of your epidermis and don't get any further, you don't ever slice any blood vessels and therefore don't have bleeding. You know that you have cut down into your dermis if you do have bleeding then, or likely. But anyway, if our skin barrier was compromised, if we have a wound, then that would serve as our point of entry for a pathogen. So a pathogen would hopefully come across something like that so that it can get inside, versus having to try to get through the entire epidermis, then through the connective tissue of the dermis and the hypodermis to get further into the body. Although really, it only needs to get through the epidermis. For example, if it wants to get into the bloodstream, if there's a damaged blood vessel in the dermis, then it can do that. So the next type of physical barrier we're going to talk about are mucous membranes. So a mucous membrane, as I mentioned, is something that secretes mucus. So we find it in the lining of the nose or the nasal cavity, the mouth, oral cavity, lungs, the respiratory tract, urinary tracts, and digestive tracts. So these are epithelial cells that are bound by tight junctions, so kind of the sewing one that I think of. So tight junctions because there is movement there, but they're also going to be producing and secreting mucus. So mucus is a moist, sticky substance It's these cells that are in the mucous membrane are going to produce this moist, sticky substance. The reason for that is because it's going to, one, cover and protect the cells of the mucous membrane. So if there is a layer of mucus on the cells, it would make it much more difficult for a pathogen to get through that first layer, that individual layer of cells in the mucous membrane, and get into the inside, because it has to work its way all the way through that goop first and then get to the cell. And hopefully by that time we have actually trapped the bacteria, trapped the pathogen, getting it stuck in the mucus rather than allowing it to work its way through the mucus and through the membrane. And then within this mucus, it actually has antimicrobial peptides. So as the bacteria is moving through the mucus, or trying to, we have these antimicrobial peptides that are produced in order to get rid of those pathogens or get rid of that bacteria. So here is an example of a mucous membrane. It's a very close-in shot. These are ciliated epithelial cells. So these right here, all these little kind of brush-like things, are called the cilia. And our ciliated epithelial cells are cells that have hair-like appendages, or cilia. And where we find this is in the upper respiratory tract. So if we think about our respiratory tract, and we know that it can get mucousy at times, it's because these little tiny cilia are getting that mucus from inside of our body and trying to get it out of the body. And this is to protect us, right? So if we think about it, we breathe in, and this is our trachea. This is supposed to be like opening to the mouth here. And then our trachea is going to bring the air in down into our bronchial tree. So this is where we have our bronchial, we have our branches here, and then those branches get smaller and smaller and smaller as we get to what are called the alveoli of the lungs, which are kind of the little bubbles or the air sacs in the lungs that allow for exchange between the cells of the body and the cells of the respiratory tract. What we're looking at here is that the respiratory system all along here are coated in ciliated epithelial cells, which means that all of the cells that are in our respiratory tract have these little tiny hairs that you can see here. And then these little tiny hairs are covered in mucus. Then when a pathogen comes in, it will get stuck in the mucus, or that's the idea, it will get stuck in the mucus, and then these little tiny cilia are going to be beating in a wave-like motion. When they're beating in a wave-like motion, it's going to move them up and out so that we cough them out or sneeze them out, but we want to get that pathogen out. So all of these little cilia end up doing this wave-like motion. So they start over here, and then they all go this direction, or the other direction, but so they all go in the same direction. So they end up waving, kind of in this direction. And so all of the cilia are going to be moving things up and out. This is called the mucociliator escalator in the respiratory tract. So our cilia are covered in mucus. It traps the microbes in the lungs to prevent us from inhaling them, so prevent them from getting all the way to our alveoli, which then exchange with the bloodstream. And then the cilia are going to move both the mucus and the microbes out of the body. So this is, again, when we have an infection, we can have bacteria growing and multiplying, and what our body is doing when it makes extra mucus is trying to trap those bacteria. If we make extra mucus, we can trap more bacteria. We trap more bacteria, we can cough it out or sneeze it out and get it out of the body. Or then we can swallow it, and then the hydrochloric acid in our stomach is going to destroy those pathogens. Now, this is a very important system for helping us to stay healthy because it's going to be constantly getting anything out of the body, right? So it can be microbes, but also other debris and things that we breathe in every day. When somebody smokes or has a disease like cystic fibrosis, this can actually damage the cilia. So when the cilia are damaged, then we don't have this mucociliary escalator happening, and therefore we don't have the ability for us to trap the microbes in the mucus and then move it on out of the body. So when this happens, microbes can easily colonize in the lungs, and then this can lead to a lot more infections. So for example, smoking when you smoke, it actually paralyzes the cilia. So paralyzing the cilia means that they just sit there and they're no longer able to move and move that mucus out of the body. Typically, smoking a cigarette will paralyze your cilia for 20 to 40 minutes. And oftentimes, a lot of people that smoke pretty regularly will go out for a cigarette at this time. So they're kind of constantly paralyzing their cilia. And by constantly paralyzing their cilia, then that allows microbes to take over. And oftentimes, people that smoke tend to have more infections, more respiratory issues, more illness than those that do not smoke in general, because they are paralyzing the cilia, which are then not able to move those pathogens out of the lungs. So another mucous membrane is our digestive tract. So we're going to take a look at that. In our digestive tract, we have what are called goblet cells. Our goblet cells are cells that are going to secrete the mucus. And in the digestive tract, it works similarly to where we have this goblet cell that is producing mucus here. So you can see our secretory vesicles that contain mucin or mucus. It's going to move to the superficial portion of the cell here, and then it's going to put it to the exterior through exocytosis. Again, mucus is going to trap pathogens, debris, whatever else comes into the body via the digestive system, and then it's going to move it out of the body. So the idea is that it has trapped it in the mucus, and then through this peristalsis, which are the muscular movements of the intestines, so we have a squeezing and pulling kind of action happening, all toward the anus. It's going to move this sloughed off mucus through the tract and out of the body with the feces. So again, it's going to be trapping the bacteria. Remember, mucus then has these antimicrobial properties to it. So the antimicrobial properties will be working on the bacteria all the while that it's stuck in the mucus. And even if it doesn't, the idea is that it would stay stuck in the mucus until it leaves the body with the feces. All right, so the next barrier is our endothelium. So these again are the cells that are lining the urinary and genital systems or tracts. Various blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and then some other tissues. So one important or major physical barrier, so preventing pathogens from getting in the body, is our blood-brain barrier. So this is protecting our central nervous system, which is our brain and our spinal cord. And that's because infections that are in the central nervous system can lead to serious and oftentimes fatal inflammation. So our body really does not want pathogens to get into our brain or our spinal cord, because our body then is going to quickly respond if that does happen. And if that does happen, our body will have a very large response, and sometimes that can be fatal because it's trying to get rid of it because it wants to make sure that it's protecting those very important cells in the body. The cell junctions here are extremely tight, so it can prevent any microbes from passing from the blood into the brain. And cerebrospinal fluid stays sterile. So throughout our spinal cord, throughout our brain, we have this flowing of fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid, and this actually stays sterile. So what we want to do is prevent anything from getting to it at all costs. So then we have our mechanical defenses. So our physical defenses, we just went through each of the physical defenses, or physical barriers rather, our physical barriers. The second were our mechanical defenses. So this is when we want to physically remove pathogens from the body. So mechanical, we're moving them away from us. So we're not killing at this point. That would be something different. That would be a chemical defense. But we're just removing them by mechanically moving them away from us. One of the ways that we see this is what we already spoke about, which is the shedding of the dead skin cells. So we're mechanically removing bacteria. When we wash our hands, when we wash our bodies, we're removing them. Or even just the constant sloughing off of our skin cells is going to hopefully take some pathogens with it as well. The expulsion of mucus. So for example, our mucociliary escalator is going to produce mucus, and then that mucus is going to mechanically move the bacteria out of the body or away from the body. And then excretion of feces. So again, in the digestive tract, moving that all the way down and removing any pathogens along with the mucus with the feces is going to be how we can mechanically remove bacteria or mechanically remove pathogens from the body. Another mechanical defense, or some mechanical defenses, are the flushing action of urine and tears. So in the kidneys, that's where we are going to be filtering our blood and washing out our microbes, trying to get rid of those microbes. It's paying very close attention to what's moving in, and it's doing its best to try to get rid of the microbes and allow what we need to get through to get through. So then also we have our eyelashes. Our eyelashes here are one way that we are mechanically removing things. It's also a physical barrier. If we can get stuff stuck in our eyelashes and also our eyebrows. So the reason we have eyebrows, the reason we have eyelashes is to prevent things from getting into our eyes, and that includes pathogens. So if pathogens could get stuck in our eyebrows, get stuck in our eyelashes, then we're hoping that they don't get to our eyes. So they prevent dust and microbes from entering the eye. And then any that enter may be flushed away by blinking and tears. So if we do happen to get a pathogen on here, then this person will likely make tears and then move it out of the body. So even if a person isn't actually like actively rubbing their eye or actively crying, just our blinking is going to allow for more fluid to go onto our eyes and then perhaps can allow that pathogen or bring that pathogen to the ear or the tear duct and then get rid of it. So then our last physical defense we're going to talk about is the microbiome, and we've spoken a lot about this, but a refresher is that these are normal resident bacteria that are in various regions of the body, and that they are going to prevent the pathogen from attaching. So again, if we have good healthy competition inside of our body, on our skin, in different areas where we have a lot of bacteria, which is everywhere, but if we're trying to defend ourselves from, not everywhere, we just said cerebrospinal fluid is sterile. Anyway, what we're doing is we are preventing the pathogen from attaching and then proliferating. So if the pathogen is trying to attach and there are a whole bunch of other bacteria and things there already, it can't attach. Plus, they'll all attack them. So this is important to keep a healthy microbiome. Cellular binding sites in competition for nutrients. Excuse me. So when we talk about our microbiome, not only are we just preventing attachment because they are there and proliferation, but also they are using cellular binding sites, our regular cells. They're using cellular binding sites, and then also they are competing with each other for nutrients, but everybody kind of stays fed except for when that pathogenic bacteria or pathogen come along and get on the skin and start making their proteases, for example. But if we have a healthy microbiome, then we have lots and lots of different species all hanging out in the same area, and so they can alert the body to getting rid of that pathogen. So our microbiome, again, we have a microbiome on the skin that we've spoken about, and our upper respiratory tract, our GI tract, and our genitourinary tracts. So for example, in the vagina, there is competition, and competition limits candida growth. And it does this by decreasing the available nutrients. So candida, which is a yeast, needs lots of nutrients in order to live, and if all of the other organisms colonize the area along with that, then they will steal the nutrients while the candida is not getting them. So this decreases our available nutrients. Now, our treatment with antibiotics. We've discussed this a bit as well, but if we take antibiotics, recall that they can kill lots of different types of bacteria, this can end up depleting our normal microbiome, or microbiota in the GI tract, for example, because we're taking this medicine or this antibiotic orally, and so it's going right into the digestive system, and then it's going to try to take out the pathogen, but oftentimes what happens is it also takes out a lot of the microbiome. And then if the microbiome is then been taken out by this antibiotic, then any other cells that weren't in the area during that time or we're kind of hiding in the body somewhere, they can come in and then they can take over because there are now lots of nutrients and there's not much competition. And that can be very dangerous because then a person gets sick a lot more often. This is actually an advantage for our pathogenic bacteria, C. difficile, for example, which is why we see a lot of C. difficile infections in hospitals, for example, but in people that were sick with something previous. And this is because they have likely taken antibiotics. After they take antibiotics, then it's going to kill off a lot of their microbiome. And then one can go in and they can fix that up and make sure that their microbiome is nice and healthy in their intestines. But if they don't, then they can be very susceptible moving forward to pathogens. The only treatment that we have for if somebody really, really, really messes up their microbiome, meaning doesn't have any at all or has very, very little, then a person can do what's called a fecal transplant. And what this does is it is exactly as it sounds. It is little tiny tubes, little tiny pills, capsules, that have another person's feces in it. This person's feces has been screened by the person that's selling fecal transplants and things. And then this is really only helpful, or not maybe only helpful, but this is really helpful for people that are having to take lots and lots of antibiotics. Maybe they're immunocompromised, and so they really need some help, something to booster, because their body just can't fight it off on its own. And so then they will take lots of antibiotics, but this can oftentimes leave the intestines desiring and needing bacteria. And if you go through and you adjust and move and get rid of the bacteria, the microbiome in your intestines, for example, that can actually be very, very dangerous. So fecal transplants are used in those extreme cases in order to restore the normal microbiota, meaning they take samples from a person that has a normal microbiota, and then that's used to kind of seed your own intestines or someone's intestines. So this is the last piece for our physical defenses. Make sure that you go back and you go over each of the different types of physical defenses and understand how they are a physical defense specifically.